Soul Garden.
Why can't you find love? How long have you really been single? Really? Having trouble finding that special soulmate? I can solve this one. Secrets of Birthdays, now live for purchase. Your love trouble? Over. All that and more at secretsofbirthdays.com. Hello, my brothers and sisters of Soul Garden, and welcome now to Astro 102 Lecture Episode 7. We are learning how to read charts, and this episode we're going to be talking about aspects. What are aspects? Well, if you have run your chart on Astro.com or any program, you'll see these lines going between the planets. These lines are the aspects, and aspects are basically the degrees or the angle at which two planets are relationship to one another, how they relationship to one another. So they can relationship at a 90-degree angle, they can relationship at a 120-degree angle, a 60-degree angle. These are the major aspects, or an opposition, which is 180 degrees. And let's start really with just the most obvious, an opposition. An opposition is literally a tug-of-war. When one planet is on one side of the chart and the other planet is on the other side of the chart. That can be anywhere in the chart, but they are opposing one another. They're basically in a tug-of-war. They're pulling on each other. One gravity wants to go this way, one gravity wants to go that way, and in a chart it represents a struggle between the two energy forces. You must find balance between the two. And so it's difficult. Oppositions are thought to be difficult transits or difficult aspects. Okay? A transit would be a momentary aspect. An aspect would be lifelong, natal chart. Okay? So let's use an example, for instance. The sun opposing the moon. The sun opposing the moon means that your awareness is opposing your emotional awareness, okay? And that's known as a full moon, by the way. That's when the moon is full, is when the sun is opposing the moon. Lots of people born on full moons. We know on a full moon things get a little crazy, right? It's about breakdown. It's about release on a full moon. And when you're born on a full moon, when the sun is opposing the moon, you have your emotions wanting to go one way and your awareness wanting to go the other. That means in this lifetime, you must find balance between your emotions and your awareness, whichever side they may happen to fall into, okay? And balance is the key. It's just like if you were a Taurus and you were dating a Scorpio, your opposite sign. I'm using Taurus because obviously I am one. Well, when you have two signs that are opposite that are dating, those two signs are each learning how to take steps towards the middle. They're learning each other's opposite sign. The sun, your awareness, is learning how to be more cognitive of your emotions. Your emotions more cognitive of the sun. Now what I find with most aspects is in your 20s up until your first Saturn return, which is 29 and a half, usually the soul lives completely off balance. Either they're all emotional for a while and then they're all mental and they cut off from their emotions. So back and forth. On Monday they're all cut off and cold. The next day they're all emotional. Back and forth, back and forth. By the second Saturn return I start to see the soul now is starting to balance it where it's a momentary thing. So for half the day it's the sun, for half the day it's the emotions. And then eventually by the second Saturn return at 60, they're learning to pay attention to both their emotions and their awareness simultaneously, where you're checking both voices or both states of awareness in your chart. One other example, the sun opposing Pluto. That's a toughie. That's because your awareness, which is where you are and where you're living, is opposing where you're regenerating yourself, which means you're either dying or you're creating, or you're dying or you're creating, or you're dying or you're creating, right? So that's also learning how to not be in a dark hole and to also, at the same time, keep moving progressively forward, right? So these can be your manic depressives, by the way, depressed people, when the sun is opposing Pluto. Another aspect I want to bring up, which is one of the most popular, is a trine. Okay, now a trine is a positive aspect. Trine is a 120-degree angle, usually represented by a blue or a green line in most astrology programs. 120 degrees is a trine. That is a positive in the sense of the two planets are talking to one another freely. This is a soul that has connected these two parts of their awareness, okay? So let's say the sun trine the moon. That is literally almost the opposite of an opposition. The sun trining the moon, no matter where it is in the chart, means that the awareness of the soul and the moon, the emotions, are always in contact with each other. So that soul is a person that can always bring up their emotions in the moment. And when they're emotional, they can always bring their common sense and awareness to the moment, so they never go too far in any one direction. And something else that's worth noting is you have to look at the houses that these planets are in. Okay, so if the sun is in the first house and it's trining the moon, then it might be connecting the first to the third house or to the fourth house, depending on how late it is. So that means that your ego is always talking to your communication areas, right? So you also want to map out the areas in which they are together. So trines are very positive. We're going to talk about grand trines in another episode. Those are grand aspects. The other major popular aspect that's important is a square. A square is a 90-degree angle. This is known as a negative or challenging aspect. 90-degree angles is basically where the two planets are blocked from one another. They're kind of hitting an intersection, right? So for instance, let's say you have your sun in the 10th house up here at the top, and you have your moon, well, I guess for you guys it'd be this way, in your 7th house, okay? A square is a block, and a block basically in reality is a fear. So what squares tell me is there is fear to be resolved in this lifetime. People will resolve squares in their lifetime when they resolve the fear. So in my example, with the sun in the 10th house and the moon in the 7th, this person has fear between going forward in their career and fear between their emotions around their marriages and partnerships. Their marriage is in the way of their career somehow, but it's based on fear. And once they face fear, that aspect will dissolve over a given lifetime. So squares are meant to be overcome. Oppositions do not really become overcome. You have to just deal with it and go with the flow with that, okay, with an opposition. And a trine you don't want to overcome. It's where things are flowing nice and harmoniously, okay? Now there are some kind of funky, well-known squares and whatnot. When Venus squares Mars, okay, which is our feminine energy and our masculine energy, there's fears between feminine and masculine. This is usually your bisexual or gay client. That's one of the little clues to bisexual or gay is a square between Venus and Mars. That's definitely an interesting one. And a lot of times when you have the sun squaring the moon, like I mentioned earlier, you have a person who's out of touch with their emotions. They are either aware or they're emotional, but they're not the same. They've got fear between letting either of those go too far. Two other little tiny aspects I'll bring up is what we call a sextile. Now a sextile is like a minor trine. A trine is when the two planets are totally talking to one another. A sextile is 60 degrees. 120 is a trine, 60 degrees is a sextile. And a sextile just means that the planets are sometimes talking to one another. So a trine is like, oh, I know this and this is the way it is. A sextile is like, I'd be willing to bet this is going to happen. So these are when the soul has a pretty good idea that these two can go together. Sometimes they're on, sometimes they're off. Doesn't always work. Then you have what you call a semi-sextile, which is a 30-degree aspect. And that's kind of when people have a hunch. I have a hunch this might be working with this. So a semi-sextile is really sensitive. You really wanted to split hairs in astrology with semi-sextile. In a standard 90-minute reading, even a 2-hour reading, I never get to semi-sextiles. I'd only look at a semi-sextile if I was going to calculate like a wedding date or analyze something like someone having cancer, something really life crazy. I'll throw in those tiny little hairs. Sextiles I'll look at sometimes just to split hairs. I mostly pay attention to the trines, the squares, and the oppositions. And that alone really tells me how really the energy of the chart is wired or not wired. And remember, from a big picture perspective, when everything is flowing harmoniously, the soul is old and has not too much to learn. When there's lots of squares and oppositions, the soul is a little bit younger, and there's definitely a lot to face. Okay, that wraps up this episode of Astro 102, The Aspects. I'll see you next week with more. Live, love, be. Why can't you find love? How long have you really been single? Really? Having trouble finding that special soulmate? I can solve this one. Secrets of Birthdays, now live for purchase. Your love trouble? Over. All that and more at secretsofbirthdays.com.
So God.